The signal came without warning, without grace, without any of the careful diplomatic coding that the Galactic Concord required for official transmissions. It was raw, unencrypted, and screaming across every frequency in the local galactic arm, like a wound torn open for the universe to see. It came from Valeth Prime, a world of 12 billion souls, a planet famous across the stars for its soaring crystal architecture and gentle insectoid people who had never built a weapon in 10,000 years of recorded history. And it said, in every language the translation systems could manage, one terrible thing: we are going to die, and no one is coming. The Kraliv Dominion had arrived 3 days earlier, a rogue war fleet of over 70 warships commanded by War Admiral Draken Salvar, a name that had become a curse word on a dozen conquered worlds, and they had thrown a blockade around the planet like a noose around a throat. Their demands were simple and absolute: total surrender, all planetary resources, and the enslavement of every living Vylithi on the surface. The Vylithi had no army, no fleet, no orbital defense platforms, no weapons of any meaningful kind. They were artists, builders, dreamers, a species that had joined the Galactic Concord precisely because the Concord had promised that civilization meant safety, that joining the community of stars meant no one would ever have to face the darkness alone. That promise was about to be broken. The Galactic Concord held its emergency summit within hours of the signal, and the Great Hall on Concord Station filled with delegates from hundreds of species, tall and short, scaled and feathered, luminous and dark, all of them speaking in grave tones about the crisis at Valeth Prime. They expressed deep concern. They formed committees. They drafted proposals for potential sanctions that might take effect in 6 to 8 standard months. And several delegations privately advised the Vylithi ambassador to consider surrender as a means of preserving lives. No fleets were dispatched. No weapons were mobilized. No one stood up in that great hall and said the only words that mattered: "We will fight for you." The galaxy watched, sorrowful and still, as it always did when the strong devoured the weak. Because the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud was simple and ugly. The Concord was built on trade and talk, not on courage, and courage was the only currency that could buy the Vylithi their survival. But the signal did not only reach the Concord, it reached Earth. It reached a small, blue, furious world on the edge of explored space. A world whose inhabitants had been admitted to the Galactic Concord only 7 years earlier. Provisional species, a designation that meant they were tolerated but not trusted, observed but not respected, considered too aggressive, too short-lived, too emotionally volatile to be taken seriously by civilizations that measured their histories in millennia. The signal hit Earth's communication networks at 1400 hours Universal Standard Time, and within minutes it was everywhere. On news feeds, on social platforms, on military channels, on personal devices in the pockets of 8 billion human beings who heard the desperate cry of a species they had never met, and felt something ancient and furious wake up inside their chests. There was no debate. There was no committee. There was no vote. General Idris Okonkwo, commander of the United Earth Defense Force, was eating lunch in his office when the signal came through his secure terminal. He set down his fork, read the translation twice, and then picked up his communication device and called the Fleet Admiralty. His voice was calm, the way a hurricane's eye is calm, and he said 4 words that would change the course of galactic history. Mobilize everything we have. Captain Lena Vasquez was running combat drills aboard the Erebus, Earth's most advanced stealth warship, when her communications officer played the signal over the bridge speakers. The bridge went silent, and Vasquez listened to the whole thing without moving, her dark eyes fixed on nothing. And when it ended, she turned to her crew and said, "We are volunteering for this. Does anyone object?" Not a single hand was raised, not a single voice spoke, and Vasquez nodded once and began plotting a course to Valith Prime before the official order had even been issued. Sergeant Major Cale Morrow was in the middle of a live-fire training exercise with his unit, the 1st Orbital Drop Shock Regiment, known across the military as the Reapers, when the signal reached him. His soldiers were the kind of humans that other humans found intimidating. Men and women who trained in conditions that galactic species classified as uninhabitable, who could function in extreme heat and freezing cold and toxic atmosphere and crushing gravity, who had been forged into something between soldiers and forces of nature. And when Morrow played the signal for them, they did not grow somber or quiet. They cheered because someone out there needed them, and there was nothing in the universe that made a Reaper happier than being needed. Dr. Asha Reeves, chief xenobiologist and the finest field medic in the UEDF, heard the signal in her laboratory, where she had been studying Velithi cellular regeneration for a research paper. She closed her files, opened her supply locker, and began packing medical kits configured for 14 different alien physiologies, because Dr. Reeves was the kind of person who prepared for emergencies that had not happened yet. And she had always known, somewhere in the back of her brilliant mind, that this day would come. And on the other side of the equation, watching all of this unfold, with compound eyes that could see spectrums humans could not even imagine, was Ambassador Yulani Set, the Velithi diplomatic attaché stationed on Earth as part of the Concorde's cultural exchange program. She had lived among humans for 2 years, had studied their art and their history and their strange contradictory nature, and she had never quite understood them until this moment, this exact moment, when she watched a species with no obligation, no treaty, no strategic interest in her homeworld begin preparing for war on behalf of people they had never met. She stood in the UEDF command center, surrounded by the organized chaos of human mobilization, officers shouting orders, screens flashing with fleet dispositions, soldiers running to their stations, and she felt something she had no Velithi word for, something that made her thorax ache and her wings tremble, something humans would have recognized instantly as hope tangled with terror. In 6 hours, General Okonkwo had assembled a strike force that would have made the Concorde faint. 40 warships, 12,000 Marines, a full support armada of medical vessels and supply ships, and enough firepower to crack a small planet. Moon. All of it pointed at Valith Prime. All of it ready to burn across the stars for a species that most humans could not even pronounce the name of correctly. Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the flagship, the UES Defiance, and addressed his fleet. And whether by accident or by very deliberate design, his broadcast was transmitted on an open channel that the entire galaxy could hear. The signal asked for help, he said, and his voice was steady and low, and carried the weight of every human who had ever run toward a burning building instead of away from it. That is enough. We do not need a treaty. We do not need permission. We do not need a reason beyond the fact that someone is afraid and alone and asking for help. We go in 6 hours, and anyone who is not ready gets left behind. And anyone who is ready should check their weapons and say whatever prayers they believe in, because we are going to remind the galaxy what humans do when someone calls out in the dark. The broadcast reached Concorde Station 17 minutes later. The delegates listened in silence. Then the silence turned to panic, because every species in that hall suddenly realized the same terrifying truth. The humans were not posturing. They were not making a political statement. They were not negotiating. They were already on their way, and nothing in the galaxy was going to stop them. The fleet moved through the dark between stars like a fist thrown across the heavens. 40 warships and their support vessels burning through slingshot FTL at speeds that every other species in the Concorde considered reckless, imprecise, and dangerously insane, which was exactly why the humans used it, because it was fast, And fast was all that mattered when 12 billion people were counting the hours until their world ended. Inside the ships, the transit was not quiet. In the cargo hold of the troop carrier UES Hammerfell, Sergeant Major Cale Morrow's Reapers ran combat drills in full armor, slamming into each other with a violence that would have hospitalized civilians, laughing when someone took a hard hit, shouting encouragement and insults in equal measure. It was chaos to any outside observer, but to the Reapers, it was ritual, it was prayer, it was the way they prepared their bodies and minds for the terrible work ahead. A Concord liaison officer named Talik, a slender, four-armed being from a species called the Osiri, assigned to observe the human response as a diplomatic formality, stood in the corner of the cargo hold, watching the Reapers with an expression that could only be described as horror. He had filed 17 reports since boarding the ship, each one more alarmed than the last, and when Morrow finally noticed him and walked over, Talik asked the question that had been eating at his mind since they left Earth orbit. "Why do they seem excited?" he asked, his translator giving his voice a thin, reedy quality. "You are going into battle against the Krayliv Dominion, a force that has conquered 37 worlds. Your fleet is outnumbered. Your species has never fought a war at this scale. By every rational calculation, many of you will die. Why are they smiling?" Morrow looked back at his soldiers, at the men and women who had volunteered for this without hesitation, who had packed their gear and kissed their families goodbye and walked onto the transport ships with grins on their faces. And he turned back to Talik and gave the only answer that made sense to a human. "Because someone out there needs us," he said. "That is the best reason to fight there is." Talik stared at him for a long time, and then he went back to his corner and began writing his 18th report, and this one simply said, "I do not think we understood what humans are." 3 decks above, Captain Lena Vasquez sat alone in the tactical center of the Erebus, surrounded by holographic displays of Krayliv fleet formations. She had been studying them for 9 hours straight, eating nothing, drinking only black coffee, her eyes moving across the patterns of Krayliv warfare, way a surgeon's eyes move across an anatomy scan. She was looking for the weakness, the crack, the one thing nobody else had found, because nobody else had ever been crazy enough to attack directly into a Krayliv blockade formation. The Krayliv were good, she would give them that. Their fleet tactics were built on overwhelming force and psychological intimidation, designed to make the enemy feel surrounded and hopeless before the first shot was ever fired. They positioned their capital ships in interlocking fields of fire, layered their smaller vessels as screening elements, and used their flagship as a command nexus that coordinated the entire fleet like a single organism. But Vasquez saw what the Krayliv could not see about themselves, because the Krayliv had never lost. They had no contingency for an enemy that did not behave like prey. Their formation was designed to contain and crush a retreating force, but it had gaps, thin places where the pattern assumed no one would be stupid enough to push forward instead of pulling back. Lena Vasquez had built her entire career on being exactly that kind of stupid. She marked the gaps on her tactical display and began writing attack vectors, and she smiled the kind of smile that made her crew nervous in the best possible way. In the medical bay of the support vessel UES Mercy, Dr. Asha Reeves stood before 42 medics and field surgeons and briefed them on what they were about to face. She had prepared dossiers on Velithi biology, on their fragile exoskeletons and their vulnerability to blunt trauma, and their unusual circulatory system that used copper-based blood. She had prepared treatment protocols for Krayliv prisoners as well, because the UEDF Code of Conduct required that enemy wounded be treated, and because Reeves believed in it. One of the younger medics, a woman named Torres, raised her hand and asked why they were bothering to plan for treating Krayliv casualties, when the Krayliv would certainly not extend the same courtesy. Reeves looked at her with steady eyes and said, Because that is the difference between us and them. We do not become monsters to fight monsters. If we stop being kind, we lose something that no victory can replace. And I will not allow that to happen on my watch. Torres nodded and did not ask again. Somewhere far behind them, the galaxy was reacting to the news that Earth had launched a full military fleet toward Valith Prime without authorization, without a Concord vote, without even the courtesy of a formal notification. This had never happened before in the entire history of the Galactic Concord, and it broke so many protocols that the legal department at Concord Station actually ran out of formal complaint forms. Several species filed protests. The Delmari called it reckless endangerment. The Scythene called it warmongering. The Pellucid Collective called it a violation of sovereignty that could destabilize the entire galactic order. But other species reacted differently. The Torvan, a warrior culture species with massive frames and a deep martial tradition, had spent decades dismissing humans as soft, hairless primates who had stumbled into space by accident. Now the Torvan High Command sat in silence around a tactical display showing the human fleet's trajectory and speed. And for the first time in living memory, they were impressed. They did not ask permission, the Torvan Fleet Father said quietly. They did not form a committee or hold a vote. They heard a cry for help and they simply went. When was the last time we did that? No one in the room had an answer. The human fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Valith system with a violence that shook local space. Slingshot exits were messy, loud, and produced energy signatures bright enough to blind sensors for 6 seconds. The Creative detected the arrival as a massive burst of radiation and initially classified it as a stellar anomaly, because no military fleet in their experience would exit FTL so close to an enemy blockade. It was suicidal, it was insane, it was exactly what the humans intended. War Admiral Draken Salvar stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Dominion's Wrath, and watched 40 human warships resolve on his sensors like ghosts stepping out of fire. He was tall, even by Kralid standards, a predator from a predator species, and he had commanded this fleet for 11 years without a single defeat. He had broken the defenses of 37 worlds, had accepted the surrender of species far older and far more powerful than these newcomers, and he felt nothing but contempt for the small, fragile creatures who had just appeared in his hunting ground. He opened a communication channel and spoke with the confidence of a being who had never been challenged by anything he could not crush. "Leave, primates," he said, and his voice carried the deep rumble of Kraliv vocal cords. "This world is claimed. You are outnumbered and outmatched. The Concord will not help you. There is nothing here for you but death." The channel was silent for 4 seconds. Then General Idris Okonkwo's voice came through, calm and clear, and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. His words were transmitted on an open channel, broadcast to every ship in the system, every relay in the sector, every listening post in the galactic arm. "We did not come because the Concord sent us," Okonkwo said. "We came because we heard them scream. You have one chance to withdraw your fleet and leave this world in peace. Take it." Salvar laughed, a harsh barking sound that his bridge crew echoed, because the idea of 40 ships threatening 70 was comedy, was absurdity, was the funniest thing the War Admiral had heard in years. He did not withdraw. On the bridge of the Defiance, Okonkwo listened to the laughter fade from the channel and nodded once, as if he had expected nothing else. He looked at his tactical officer and gave a single quiet order, and the order went out to every ship in the fleet, and 40 warships powered their weapons in unison like a choir of thunder. On the Erebus, Vasquez's hands moved across her console, and the most advanced stealth warship humanity had ever built vanished from every sensor in the system, like a ghost dissolving into shadow. In the drop bays of the Hammerfell, Morrow's Reapers loaded into their orbital drop pods, 12,000 soldiers, sealing their helmets, and checking their weapons, and saying the things soldiers say before action. The world catches fire. Some prayed, some cursed, some simply breathed and waited. And on the surface of Valith Prime, in a basement shelter in the besieged capital city, Ambassador Yulani Set held a battered scanner in her trembling hands and watched 40 new signatures appear in orbit. Signatures that were not Kraylev. Signatures that were broadcasting Earth identification codes. And she felt her wings unfold involuntarily, which was the Valithi equivalent of a gasp. And she pressed the scanner against her chest and began to weep. Not from fear, from something she had no word for in her own language, something that tasted like sunrise after endless night, something that the humans she had lived among for 2 years would have recognized immediately. Hope, desperate and wild and burning, because someone had actually come. The first shot came from a ship that was not supposed to exist on any sensor in the system, and it hit the Kraylev flagship exactly where it would hurt the most. Captain Vasquez had threaded the Erebus through the gaps she had found in the Kraylev formation, the gaps that existed because no enemy had ever been insane enough to fly deeper into the blockade instead of away from it. And she had positioned her ship less than 800 meters from the Dominion's wrath, close enough that the flagship's own weapons could not depress their firing angles low enough to target her. And from that impossible range, she fired 6 shield-breaker torpedoes directly into the flagship's main shield generators. The explosions ripped through the Kraylev flagship like lightning through glass. And for 3 critical seconds, every Kraylev captain in the fleet stared at their displays in disbelief. They had expected posturing, they had expected a standoff, they had expected the humans to make threats and then wait for the Concorde to intervene. Instead, they got torpedoes fired from the ship that had materialized out of nothing. And in those 3 seconds of shock, the rest of the human fleet struck. General Okonkwo had planned the opening assault with the precision of a man who understood that surprise was worth more than numbers. Every human warship fired simultaneously, coordinated to the millisecond, each one targeting a specific Kraylev vessel with a specific weapon package designed to exploit the exact vulnerability that Earth's intelligence division had identified in Kraylev ship design. The sky above Valith Prime erupted in light as 39 ships unleashed everything they had. The Kraylev fleet scrambled to respond, and they were not weak. War Admiral Salvar, despite the damage to his flagship, roared orders and his fleet began to reform, because the Kraylev were predators, and predators did not flee at the first sign of resistance. Kraylev warships returned fire with heavy plasma batteries that struck human vessels with devastating force. And the human destroyer UES Valiant took 3 direct hits in the first minute of combat, and lost her port engine array in a burst of flame and shrapnel. But the humans fought differently than anything the Kraylev had ever encountered. Their ships did not form defensive lines or fall back to regroup. Instead, they pushed forward, drove deeper into the Kraylev formation, used the enemy's own ships as cover, forced close-range engagements where the Kraylev's superior numbers could not be brought to bear. Human captains feinted retreat and then slingshot their ships back at ramming speed, forcing Kraylev vessels to break formation to avoid collisions. Electronic warfare suites jammed Kraylev communications with bursts of human audio at frequencies that the Kraylev found physically painful. And in a touch that would become legendary, someone on the Erebus began broadcasting heavy metal music across the Kraylev command channel. A wall of screaming guitars and thundering drums that disrupted Kraylev coordination and terrified their sensor operators, who had never heard anything like it. The orbital battle raged, and it was bloody and horrible and magnificent. The humans were taking damage, losing ships, watching friends die in the vacuum of space. But they were not stopping. They were not slowing. They were not doing any of the things that prey was supposed to do when the predator bared its teeth. While the sky burned, Sergeant Major Morrow stood in his drop pod aboard the Hammerfell and watched the countdown timer tick towards 0. Around him, 8,000 Reapers sat in their pods like bullets in a magazine, their armor, weapons locked, hearts hammering. The ship shook with the vibrations of the battle outside, and through the hull, Morrow could hear the distant thunder of weapons fire. And he grinned, because that thunder meant the fleet was buying them time. The bay doors opened, and the pods launched. 8,000 armored capsules screamed through the atmosphere of Valith Prime, burning through the sky like a meteor shower made of steel and fury. Krayliv anti-air batteries opened up from the surface, and the sky became a killing field. Pods were hit and shattered. Soldiers died in fire before they ever touched the ground, and Morrow watched the casualty counter on his helmet display climb with every second of descent. But the Reapers had trained for this. They had trained in worse conditions than this, had dropped through volcanic ash and acid rain and electromagnetic storms that would kill an unshielded human in minutes. And the pods that survived the descent slammed into the surface of Valith Prime, around the besieged capital city with enough force to crack pavement. And the doors blew open, and the humans came out fighting. The Krayliv ground forces had occupied the capital for 3 days, herding Valithi civilians toward processing camps where they would be catalogued, branded, and assigned to labor battalions. The Krayliv soldiers were large, heavily armored, and efficient. They operated in hunting packs of 6 to 8, using their superior size and natural aggression to control the terrified Valithi population through pure physical intimidation. They were not prepared for an enemy that charged toward them. The Reapers hit the Krayliv ground positions like a wave of concentrated violence. They moved in fire teams, 4 soldiers working in perfect coordination, covering each other as they advanced through the shattered streets of the Valithi capital. They were smaller than the Krayliv, lighter, less armored, and they did not care, because humans had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting things bigger than themselves and winning through sheer stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Morrow led his company through the eastern district, clearing building after building, and the Krayliv soldiers they encountered fought hard. They were warriors, trained killers, and they did not go down easily. But they had a fatal flaw that no amount of training could fix. Their hunting instincts were calibrated for prey that ran. When prey did not run, when prey screamed and charged and fought with a fury that seemed completely disconnected from any rational survival instinct, the Krayliv hesitated, just for a moment, just for a heartbeat. And a heartbeat was all a Reaper needed. In the Western District, Morrow's 2nd Platoon breached a processing facility where 400 Valithi civilians were being held. They blew through the reinforced doors with breaching charges, poured into the facility in a storm of gunfire and shouted commands, and eliminated the Krayliv guards in 11 seconds of precise, brutal violence. When the smoke cleared, 400 Valithi stood trembling in the wreckage, their compound eyes wide, their wings pressed flat against their bodies in terror, waiting for whatever new horror had come for them. Morrow walked through the crowd of terrified civilians until he reached a small Valithi child huddled against a wall, shaking so badly that her wings made a buzzing sound. He knelt down, and his armored knees cracked the tile floor, and he reached up and removed his helmet so she could see his face, his human face with its soft skin and strange round eyes. And he said, in the gentlest voice a man covered in blood and battle dust could manage, "It is okay. We are here now." The child looked at him, and she did not understand his words because the translator took a moment to process. But she understood his eyes, because kindness looks the same in every species. Above them, the orbital battle reached its crisis. War Admiral Salvar, enraged beyond reason by the atrocities, human resistance, ordered his reserve fleet to engage and began charging the fleet's planetary bombardment array, a weapon system designed to turn the surface of a world into molten glass. If he could not have Valith Prime, he would burn it, and every creature on it, human and Velithi alike. Vasquez detected the energy buildup from the Erebus, and she understood immediately what it meant. She ran the calculations in her head, and the math was not good. The bombardment array would be fully charged in 4 minutes, and the only way to stop it was to get close enough to destroy it before it fired. And the only ship fast enough and stealthy enough to do that was hers. She did not call Okonkwo for permission. There was no time, and she already knew what he would say, and she already knew what she was going to do regardless. "All hands," she said over the ship's intercom, her voice as steady as bedrock. "We are making a run at the bombardment array. This is going to be close, and it is going to hurt. If anyone wants off, say so now." No one said a word. The Erebus surged forward, dropping her stealth systems to divert all power to engines and weapons, and she drove directly into the heart of the Kraliv formation like a blade aimed at a throat. Kraliv ships fired on her from every angle, and the Erebus shook and screamed as her hull took hit after hit. Armor plating tearing away, systems failing, atmosphere venting from a dozen breaches. Vasquez held course. At point-blank range, close enough that the bridge crew could see the hull plates of the bombardment ship through the forward viewport. She fired everything the Erebus had, every torpedo, every missile, every energy weapon, all of it concentrated on the bombardment array. The array detonated. The explosion consumed 3 Kraliv capital ships and sent a shockwave through the formation that knocked a dozen more vessels tumbling out of position. The Erebus was hurled backward by the blast, spinning, dark, venting fire and atmosphere, her engines dead, her systems failing one by one. On the bridge, Vasquez lay against her command chair with blood running from a gash on her forehead, her consoles sparking, half her bridge crew unconscious. She reached for her communications panel with a hand that shook only slightly and opened a channel to the fleet. "Bombardment array neutralized," she said. "You are welcome." And across the battlefield, for the first time in recorded galactic history, a Kraliv fleet hesitated, because the predators had finally met something they did not know how to hunt. On the surface, in a makeshift triage center, in the basement of a shattered Velithi temple, Dr. Reeves worked without stopping, her hands moving between human wounded and Velithi wounded without distinction, stitching, bandaging, injecting, saving. A Velithi elder watched her treat a Reaper who had been shot twice and had still carried a wounded Velithi child 3 blocks to safety before collapsing. And the elder asked her the question that the entire galaxy was beginning to ask. How can the same species do such terrible violence and such gentle kindness? Reeves did not look up from her work. "That is the whole point," she said. "We choose." The Kraliv fleet was breaking, and War Admiral Draken Solvar could feel it, the way a captain feels his ship groaning before the hull gives way. Not in the data on his screens, not in the damage reports flooding his command channel, but in the silence between his officers, the way their eyes no longer met his, the way their hands hovered over their consoles as if waiting for permission to do the one thing no Kraliv fleet had ever done: run. He had lost 17 ships, 17, to a force half his size, a species that had been traveling between stars for less than a century, a species that the Kraliv Intelligence Division had classified as negligible threat, limited combat experience, no significant military tradition beyond internal conflicts. And that classification now seemed like the most catastrophic failure of intelligence in the history of the Dominion. His flagship's shields were crippled from the Erebus's opening salvo. His bombardment array was a field of expanding debris that had taken 3 of his capital ships with it, and the human fleet, battered, bleeding, burning, had not retreated a single kilometer. Instead, the human ships had reformed into an aggressive formation that pointed directly at the heart of his remaining force like a spear aimed at his chest, and they were advancing. Salvar watched them come, and felt something he had never experienced in 11 years of conquest. Uncertainty. He was a predator, bred from a predator species, and every instinct in his body told him that wounded prey should be limping away, should be protecting itself, should be showing the signs of submission that signaled the end of a hunt. But these creatures were wounded, and they were coming closer, faster, with their weapons hot and their formation tight, and the signal his instincts were receiving made no sense at all. His sub-commanders were the first to crack. 3 Krayliv captains on the outer edge of the formation broke rank without orders and began accelerating away from the battlefield, their ships turning tail and burning hard for open space. Solvar screamed at them over the command channel, called them cowards, called them carrion eaters, and when 2 of them did not respond, he ordered their ships fired upon. One was destroyed by its own fleet, a bright flash of Krayliv killing Krayliv, and the sight of it sent a shudder through every remaining crew in the formation. But fear was a fire that could not be contained once it had been lit, and the damage was done. The fleet's cohesion was crumbling, ships drifting out of formation, captains making quiet calculations about their chances if they stayed versus their chances if they ran. Salvar knew he was losing, not the battle, not yet, but the thing that mattered more than any battle, the belief in Krayliv invincibility that had held 37 conquered worlds in submission. If his fleet retreated here, if the story spread that a Krayliv war fleet had been fought to a standstill by a species of soft, clawless primates, the consequences would ripple through the Dominion like cracks through ice. He opened a channel to the human flagship. "General," he said, and he forced his voice to carry the authority he no longer fully felt. "I will make you an offer. The Dominion will withdraw from Valith Prime if Earth agrees to cede any claim on this system, and pledges to never interfere in Dominion operations again. This is a generous offer. Take it, and save what remains of your fleet." The channel hummed with static for a moment, and then Okonkwo's voice came through, and it carried no anger, no triumph, no emotion at all, just the flat, immovable certainty of a man who had already decided how this would end. "We do not have a claim on Valith Prime," Okonkwo said. "It is not ours. It belongs to the people you tried to enslave. You are not negotiating with us, War Admiral. You are surrendering to them. If the Valithi accept your withdrawal, you may leave. If they do not, we have more ammunition than you have ships, and I have more patience than you have time." The channel fell silent. Salvar stood on his bridge, surrounded by officers who would not look at him, commanding a fleet that was unraveling around him. And he understood with terrible clarity that he had not merely been outfought, he had been outmaneuvered in a way that no amount of firepower could answer. The human had placed the decision in the hands of the Valithi, had made the surrender about them and not about Earth, had turned a military defeat into a moral one that the Krayliv would never be able to rewrite. For 30 seconds, Salvar said nothing. Then he gave the order to withdraw, and his voice cracked when he said it. And every officer on his bridge heard it crack. And the Krayliv fleet, the fleet that had never retreated, the fleet that had crushed 37 worlds, the fleet that was supposed to be invincible, turned away from Valith Prime and limped into the dark. On the surface, the ground war ended not with a bang, but with a cascade of surrenders. Krayliv soldiers, cut off from orbital support and receiving no communications from their fleet, began dropping their weapons one by one. They were predators, but they were also pragmatic, and predators that had been abandoned by their pack understood instinctively that the hunt was over. Morrow's reapers accepted the surrenders with rough efficiency. They were not gentle about it, because gentleness was not in their training manual, but they were disciplined. Prisoners were disarmed, restrained, and moved to holding areas with the mechanical precision of soldiers doing a job they did not enjoy, but would do correctly. There was a moment, quiet and strange, when a Kryliv warrior, easily twice Morrow's height, with claws that could have torn through armor plating, dropped his weapon and knelt on the shattered pavement in front of Morrow's squad. The Kryliv looked at Morrow with eyes that held something between rage and disbelief, as if he still could not understand how this small, soft creature had beaten him. Morrow looked up at him, this massive predator on its knees, and said, "Smart choice," and then turned to his squad and ordered them to give the prisoner water, because a human soldier could break your army in the morning and offer you a drink in the afternoon, and see no contradiction in either act. The galaxy, meanwhile, was experiencing something very close to a collective nervous breakdown. The Galactic Concord erupted. Formal censure proceedings were initiated against Earth within hours of the battle's conclusion. The charges were extensive: unauthorized military action, violation of Concord sovereignty protocols, unilateral intervention in a territorial dispute, reckless endangerment of galactic peace, and 14 other violations that the legal department had identified, and 3 more they were still drafting. Several species demanded that Earth be expelled from the Concord entirely, stripped of its provisional status, and subjected to economic sanctions. But there was a problem with this plan, and the problem was footage. Every moment of the Battle of Valith Prime had been recorded by human ship cameras, by Kryliv sensors, by Concord observation satellites, by Valithi civilians with personal recording devices, and the footage had spread across the galactic networks faster than any censure resolution could be drafted. Billions of beings across thousands of worlds watched the humans charge into impossible odds for a species they owed nothing to. Watched Morrow kneel beside a terrified Valithi child. Watched Reeves treat enemy wounded with the same care she gave her own. Watched Vasquez drive her ship into the bombardment array to save a world that was not hers. The Torvon, the warrior species who had dismissed humans for decades, sent a single encrypted message to Earth's embassy, and it said, "We were wrong about your kind. We would be honored to fight beside you." And that message was worth more than any treaty, because the Torvon did not give praise lightly, and they had never, in their entire history, asked to stand beside another species. 3 Concord delegations quietly withdrew their censure votes, and then 5 more. And then the political arithmetic began shifting in ways that made the anti-Earth faction very uncomfortable. But the victory was not clean, and it was not cheap. Earth's fleet had lost 7 warships, each one a graveyard of crew members who would never go home. Over 2,400 soldiers had died in the battle and the ground campaign, their names already being engraved on a memorial wall that General Okonkwo had ordered constructed before the last Kryliv ship had even left the system. The Erebus was a wreck, held together by emergency patches and the sheer stubbornness of her engineering crew. Morrow had lost a third of his company, soldiers he had trained and led and known by name. Dr. Reeves had been working for 40 straight hours. She had run out of human-compatible painkillers 12 hours ago, and had been treating her own wounded without anesthesia since then, holding their hands and talking them through the pain, while she stitched and set and stabilized. She had not complained, had not rested, had not even sat down, and when one of her medics tried to force her to take a break, she looked at him with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted, and said, "When everyone is stable, I will rest, not before." Okonkwo walked through the medical bay of the Defiance that evening, moving slowly from bed to bed, and at every bed he stopped and learned the soldier's name and asked how they were, and thanked them for what they had done. He carried the weight of every death on his shoulders, and it was visible in the way he moved, the slight bow of his back, the heaviness in his steps. But he did not break, because his people needed him whole, and he would give them that, even if it cost him everything he had left inside. The cost was real, and it was terrible, and no one pretended otherwise. But it had been paid willingly, and that was the thing that the galaxy could not stop talking about. Not the tactics, not the weapons, not the caps, ships, but the fact that 12,000 humans had crossed the stars to bleed for strangers, and not one of them had been forced, not one of them had been ordered, not one of them had needed any reason beyond a scream in the dark, and the knowledge that someone was afraid. Ambassador Yulani Set stood in the shattered central square of the Velithi capital, as the sun set through clouds of smoke and dust, and she addressed the surviving human forces in a voice that trembled but did not break. "We sent our cry into the void, and expected nothing," she said, and around her thousands of Velithi citizens had gathered, silent and watching. "You answered with everything you had. My people have no warriors. We have no word for what you are, but we will create one, and it will be the most honored word in our language." The Reapers stood in formation before her, battered and bloody and bone-tired, their armor scorched and dented, their ranks thinner than they had been that morning. And as the ambassador spoke, several of them began to cry, quietly, without shame, without hiding it, because humans could kill with terrible efficiency, and weep with terrible honesty, and see no weakness in either. Morrow stood at the front of his company, and his eyes were wet, and he did not wipe them, and he stood at attention until the ambassador finished speaking, and then he saluted her, a human gesture she had never received before, and she understood it perfectly, because respect looks the same in every species. The censure vote against Earth failed, and it did not fail quietly. It failed spectacularly, collapsing in the Grand Hall of Concord Station like a building with no foundation, because the delegates who had drafted it discovered something they had not anticipated. Their own citizens would not let them pass it. On a dozen worlds, members of species that had never held a protest in their collective memory took to the streets, carrying images from the Battle of Valith Prime. Images of human soldiers shielding Velithi children. Images of medics treating wounded aliens with the same desperate care they gave their own. Images of a battered fleet advancing into superior numbers because retreating was simply not something they were willing to consider. The message from these protests was not subtle, and it cut the Concord's political establishment to the bone. If the Concord will not protect us, the humans will. 7 delegations that had originally supported the censure withdrew their votes in a single day, and by the end of the week, the motion was dead, buried under the weight of public opinion from across the galaxy. And in its place, something new and uncomfortable began to take shape. A grudging recognition that Earth had done what the entire Galactic Concord had been too afraid to do, and that this fact could not be argued away no matter how many protocols had been violated. The Kraliv Dominion was experiencing its own reckoning. War Admiral Salvar returned to Kraliv space expecting punishment, and he received it. The ruling council executed him publicly, not for the lives he had lost or the resources he had wasted, but for the act of retreat itself, because the Kraliv Empire was built on the mythology of invincibility, and Salvar had shattered that mythology in front of the entire galaxy. But killing the Admiral could not unkill the truth, and the truth was spreading. On 37 conquered worlds, populations that had submitted to Kraliv rule because resistance seemed impossible began to whisper new words to each other. The humans beat them. The humans made them run. If the Kraliv can be beaten, then perhaps we can be free. Within weeks, 3 subjugated worlds had launched insurgencies, small and desperate and probably doomed, but burning with a hope that had not existed before a fleet of human ships had crossed the stars and proven that the Kraliv could bleed. The humans had not just saved Valith Prime, they had cracked the foundation of an empire, and the cracks were spreading. General Idris Okonkwo returned to Earth and walked into a review board hearing with the same calm expression he wore into battle. The board formally reprimanded him for acting without Concord authorization, for risking Earth's diplomatic standing, for making decisions that could have plunged the galaxy into a wider war. He accepted the reprimand without argument, signed the formal acknowledgement, and then received a quiet promotion to Supreme Commander of Earth's newly expanded defense forces. Because the people who ran Earth understood the difference between what was legal and what was right. And they knew that the next time a signal came screaming out of the dark, they would need Okonkwo to answer it. He began drafting a proposal the next day, a galactic rapid response force, open to any species willing to contribute ships, soldiers, or support to a standing fleet, that would do what the Concord's committees could not: respond to threats in real time, with real force, before the bodies started piling up. It was bold and unprecedented, and many said it was impossible. But within the first week, 4 species had applied to join, and the Torvan were first among them. Captain Lena Vasquez spent 3 weeks in a medical facility recovering from her injuries. The gash on her forehead left a scar she refused to have removed, calling it a souvenir. And when she was cleared for duty, she returned to the Erebus, which had been towed back to Earth's orbital shipyards for a complete rebuild. The engineers had not merely repaired her ship, they had upgraded it, reinforced it, made it faster and deadlier and harder to kill. And when Vasquez walked onto her new bridge for the first time, she ran her fingers along the console and said to her crew, "Next time, we will not even need to get that close." Her crew laughed, and they believed her, because they had followed her into the throat of a Kraliv fleet and come out the other side, and there was nothing in the universe that could frighten them after that. She named the rebuilt vessel Erebus Reborn, and the name became a legend in its own right. Sergeant Major Cale Morrow did not go home when the battle ended. He stayed on Valith Prime for 3 additional weeks, volunteering to coordinate ground security during the reconstruction effort. His Reapers patrolled the streets of the capital, alongside Valithi civilian volunteers, and the sight of armored human soldiers helping insectoid aliens clear rubble and rebuild walls became one of the most shared images on the galactic networks. During those weeks, Morrow formed an unlikely friendship with a Valithi structural engineer named Tika. She was small even by Valithi standards, with iridescent wings and a habit of tilting her head sideways when she was confused, which was often because humans confused her enormously. She could not understand how the same beings who had fought with such terrifying ferocity could sit in the rubble of her city and share their food rations with strangers and laugh at jokes she did not comprehend. Morrow taught her to play poker during the long evenings when the reconstruction crews had finished for the day. Tika was spectacularly terrible at it, unable to grasp the concept of bluffing, because the Valithi had no cultural framework for deliberate deception, and Morrow found this so endlessly entertaining that he kept teaching her anyway. They sat in the ruins of what had been a park, human and alien, soldier and engineer, playing cards by lamplight while a shattered city rebuilt itself around them, and it was the most peaceful thing Morrow had experienced in years. Dr. Asha Reeves was offered a prestigious research position at a Concord medical station, a facility with resources and technology that would have made any xenobiologist weep with joy. She declined it in a single sentence, requesting instead to be reassigned to the UEDF's forward deployment roster, wherever the next crisis might be. When her commanding officer asked her why she would turn down the opportunity of a lifetime, she said, "Somebody will always need help, and I would rather be early than late." And that was the end of the discussion, because no one who had watched Reeves work for 40 hours straight on blood and coffee and sheer willpower was going to argue with her about where she belonged. Ambassador Yulani Set became the Valithi people's first ambassador to Earth, a position that had not existed before the battle, and was created specifically for her, because the Valithi government understood that their relationship with humanity was now the most important diplomatic bond their species had ever formed. Set threw herself into the role with a passion that surprised even her own people, building cultural exchanges and trade agreements and educational programs designed to weave the two species together so tightly that no force in the galaxy could separate them. She was invited to deliver a lecture at a human university, the first alien to ever do so, and she chose her topic with care. Why the galaxy underestimated the species that runs toward danger. The lecture hall was filled beyond capacity, and when she spoke about watching the human fleet arrive in Valithi orbit, about the moment she saw those 40 ships appear on her scanner, and felt something break open in her chest, half the audience was crying, and the other half was trying not to. The galaxy was different now, and everyone knew it. Humanity was no longer the provisional species, no longer the newcomers to be watched and managed and kept at arm's length. They were something the Concord had no category for, something that did not fit into the neat taxonomies of predator and prey, warrior and pacifist, threat and ally. They were all of these things simultaneously, a species that could destroy with one hand and heal with the other, that could fight with the savagery of apex predators and weep at the suffering of creatures they had never met. Other species began requesting human military advisors, not because they wanted to learn human tactics, though they did, but because they wanted to understand the thing that drove humans to act when no one else would, the strange fire that burned in human hearts and made them incapable of hearing a cry for help without answering it. Humanitarian missions were launched across the Concord, with human volunteers at their core, and a dozen worlds that had once feared humanity now competed for alliance agreements. The Concord itself began to change, slowly and grudgingly, because the humans had forced a question that the comfortable, cautious diplomats had spent centuries avoiding. What is the point of a galactic civilization that will not protect its own? It was a question that had no comfortable answer, and it reshaped debates and policies and priorities in ways that would take decades to fully unfold. But it had been asked, and it could not be unasked. And on a quiet street, in the rebuilding capital of Valith Prime, in a small home that still smelled of fresh construction materials and hope, a Valithi child sat on the floor of her room with a piece of soft crystal and a carving tool. She was the same child Morrow had knelt beside in the processing facility, the same child who had looked into a human face and seen kindness through the smoke and the blood. She carved slowly, carefully, shaping the crystal with the patience that was natural to her species. And when she was finished, she placed the figure on a shelf beside her bed. It was rough and simple, the work of young hands still learning their craft. An armored figure with no claws, no fangs, no natural weapons of any kind, standing upright with a weapon in one hand and the other hand reaching out, open, offering. Her mother came into the room and saw the figure and asked what it was. The child looked up at her with compound eyes that reflected the light of a world that had almost died and had been saved by strangers from across the stars. "A human," she said. "They come when you call, and somewhere out in the galaxy, on a ship called the Erebus Reborn, a woman with a scar on her forehead watched the stars slide past her viewport and waited for the next signal. Because it would come, it always came, and when it did, she and every human who heard it would do exactly what they had always done. They would answer, they would go, and the darkness would learn, once again, that it was not as empty as it thought. Somewhere in the black, there was a species of small, soft, stubborn, impossible creatures who had decided a long time ago that no one should ever have to scream into the void, alone.